Okay, we're going to talk about the short story Racitatif by Toni Morrison. Now, it's going to be very difficult for me to reproduce what I attempt to do in class with this story and reproduce that online. But we're going to give it a shot to see what we can do. Now, as you know, the story revolves around two main characters, Twyla and Roberta. Throughout the story, we see when they first meet, while they're in the home for the girls, we see them meet again at the restaurant. We see them meet again at the store, and we see them meet again at the protest on busing. What I would like you to do right now is to take a moment, and I want you to hit pause. And I want you to write down which character is black, which character is white, and put down one or two reasons why you think one character is white and one character is black. So go ahead and hit pause right now and answer those questions. Okay, hopefully you hit pause and you took the moment to write down who's white, who's black, and giving me one or two reasons why you think one person's white and one person's black. See, the thing is that in this story, Morrison never tells us who's white or who's black. She gives us an indication of race in the very beginning when she says that the two girls, when the narrator talks about the two girls being nicknamed Salt and Pepper. So we give an indication that race is part of their identity. But who's white and who's black is never told to us. What this tells me right now is that each and every one of you who are watching this video, who have read this story, sees race. That it's inherently impossible in a racially constructed society like the United States to be colorblind. We all see race. And that's not what the problem is. It's okay, we should recognize race. This idea when people come up to me and say, when I see you, Carlos, I just see a person, I don't see a brown person. No, you see a brown person. You want to eliminate the idea of race from how you perceive someone like me, but you see race. You see blacks, you see Asians, you see Latinos, you see Native Americans, you see whites. We all see race. Now, the way to look at this idea of race is what I call the racial/racist lens. This is something that we all have as part of how we learn to negotiate our society, how we learn to interact in terms of race in U.S. society. Now, we have a racial lens. Everybody has one, as I just pointed out. The racial lens is your perception of race. Let me say that again. The racial lens is your perception of race. Your perception of race is influenced by three primary issues. One, your location within race. How you identify in terms of race. Second, your interaction with race. Those people who grew up in a largely, say, white environment are going to have a different perception of race than those people who are growing up in a more racially diverse environment. And third, the time and context by which your racial location and your interaction with race takes place. For example, my grandparents' perception of race is very different than my perception of race, and my perception of race is very different than my children or grandchildren's perception of race. So again, we all have a racial lens. Your racial lens is your perception of race. It's influenced by your location within race, how you identify in terms of race, your interaction with race, and the extent of that interaction, and the time and context. Now, on the other hand, we also have what I call our racist lens. And our racist lens is the value we place on our perception of race. It involves the acquisition and maintenance of power. It connects to the idea of invalidation, the invalidation-validation process that I talked about earlier. That we created a type of setup where we invalidate the person we see as different in such a way to validate our sense of self. And it involves the acquisition and maintenance of power. So again, we have a racial lens, but we also have a racist lens, the value we place on our perception of race. It involves the acquisition and maintenance of power. It is involved in the invalidation and validation process, that how we come to distinguish difference in our society. Excuse me. The key to this idea is to always be able, or to take time to reflect on how your racist lens influences your racial lens. None of us are free or somehow raised in a vacuum where we're not influenced by racist ideologies in this society. So we need to acknowledge that idea, that influence is out there. And some people are influenced in ways other people are not. So you have to take time to internalize it, to see how your racist lens influence your racial lens. And it's important to understand this so we can get beyond the idea of being colorblind, to acknowledge race. Let me put it, and it's an interesting dynamic when we talk about, say, the difference between our reluctance to recognize race, but our acceptance to recognize gender. When it comes to the recognition of race, the idea of being colorblind becomes a very important ideology in our society. But we are not colorblind. Like I've said before, it's inherently impossible to be colorblind. So it's the idea that when I just see you, I just see a person, I don't see a black person. That is a myth that doesn't exist. And it talks about our reluctance to identify, or our reluctance to acknowledge that we see race. But you need to ask yourself, if you're a man watching this video, have you ever had anybody come up to you and say, listen, when I see you, I just see a person, I don't see a man? Or have any of the women who are watching this video ever had anybody come up to them and say, when I see you, I just see a person, I don't see a woman? So the question is that why are we so willing to recognize gender, but so unwilling to recognize race? What is it about race that frightens us? That creates this apprehension that we want to move towards a colorblind society, but we have this perfect acceptance of recognizing gender, that it's okay for us not to live in a gender-blind society, but we are trying to live in a colorblind society. We see gender, we see race, we see them both within these kind of constructs of these different lenses, a racist lens, or a gender sexist lens. These are the way this process works. Now what Morrison does is that she uses stereotypes to introduce us to these different characters. It is through these stereotypes that we start to identify race. So we see certain characteristics that we assign to what it is to be black, and certain characteristics that we assign to what it is to be white in our society. And these stereotypes influence then that perception of race, the way that we see race. So it's important to remember that stereotypes play a huge role. In fact, I would argue that right now, most of the people watching this video know race only through stereotypes. Ask yourself, how many of you have taken an ethnic studies class before? How many of you have taken a class on African Americans or Chicanos, Latinos, Asian and Pacific Islanders, or Native Americans? If you haven't taken any of these classes, then most of what you know about race, you learn from the media, your friends, and family. since this is your first introduction to race on an academic level. And the media, which is the number one means of maintaining stereotypes or creating stereotypes, and your family or friends are influencing these stereotypes. They're not raised in the vacuum as well. They don't exist in the vacuum. So what you're doing is that you're learning race through stereotypes for the most part. When we talk about stereotypes, we have to remember that stereotypes are more than simply generalizations. Let me say that again. Stereotypes are more than simply generalizations. They are more than just simply caricatures of a person that robs that person of their subjectivity. And it's more than just simply a racist act. Stereotypes are the way our racist lens affects our racial lens in order to acquire and maintain power. Again, stereotypes are more than just simply generalizations. They are more than simply caricatures that rob somebody of their subjectivity. They are more than just simply a racist act. Stereotypes are the ways our racist lens affects our racial lens in order to acquire and maintain power. So to end this video, the fact that you were able to identify one person as white and one person as black when the writer never told us who's white or who's black, or even if you were confused over who was white or who was black, means you see race. That you are not colorblind. And that once you acknowledge that and you understand that this idea of race involves a racial and racist lens, and that most of what you know about race is through the stereotypes, the racial stereotypes of this country, acknowledging that allows us to move on, to have a greater understanding, a more complex discourse on the nature of race in our society. Thank you.